The first Cyberwar Part 1, Ghost in the Wires, Washington, 1942. The air in the Pentagon offices was thick with anxiety and cigarette smoke. War was raging on all fronts, but in addition to the battles in the air, at sea, and on land, another, invisible and silent battle was raging, the battle for information. The German Enigma and the Japanese Purple machines were creating codes that were considered unbreakable. The Allies were suffering heavy losses, and many military strategists secretly suspected that the reason was not just the enemy's tactical superiority, but that the enemy was reading their maps while they remained blind. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that one of the most daring and fantastical projects of the war was born. His father was Dr. Alan Weingarten, a leading physicist and cryptographer at Bell Laboratories, a man with a mind capable of seeing connections where others saw only chaos. He sat in his office, cluttered with diagrams and blueprints, rereading for the 100th time the report on the sinking of yet another convoy in the Atlantic. The convoy had taken a different route, known only to a handful of people at headquarters. A coincidence? Weingarten didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in mathematics and in information leaks. It dawned on him late at night while listening to a recording of an intercepted German message. It wasn't Morse code, but a voice transmitted over a secret telephone line using a complex encryption system. The Germans called this technology Sachsenhausen. The message was encoded using a noise-like signal, making it indistinguishable from static to anyone without an exact copy of the encryption key. Manual decryption using brute force took weeks, if not months. By that point, the information was already useless. What if, Weingarten thought, looking at his record player, we could fight a machine with another machine? Not just a calculator, but something that could think, or at least iterate through options at the speed of thought. The idea was simple to formulate and incredibly complex to implement. Create a device capable of analyzing an encrypted voice signal, recognizing patterns in it, generating all possible key combinations, and selecting the correct one in minutes, not days. He called his project Ghost, for he was supposed to capture intangible signals, voices in the ether, and make them speak. The project was codenamed SIGSALY, a meaningless string of letters designed to convey nothing to the uninitiated. The best minds from Bell Labs and conscripted military cryptographers were thrown into its implementation. The work raged in strict secrecy in a basement converted into a laboratory, access to which was restricted to fingerprinted passes and unheard of measure at the time. The main problem was speed. The human brain couldn't handle the volume of calculations. A computer was needed, but computers as we know them today didn't exist. Weingarten's team began building one from scratch. They used thousands of vacuum tubes, complex magnetic drum systems for data storage, and this was the most revolutionary idea: phonographic records to generate random keys. The principle was ingenious. The Sachsenhausen cipher was based on one-time pads. SIGSALY was supposed to exploit the same vulnerability, but in an automated fashion. Two identical gramophone records containing a recording of truly random noise, one for the sender, one for the receiver, were used as keys. If an enemy intercepted a message, it was impossible to decipher it without an exact copy of the noise. The Ghost's job was to quickly play a library of possible noise keys against the intercepted signal. Until a match was found, the engineers toiled day and night. The lab resembled hell. Red-hot vacuum tubes raised the temperature to an unbearable level, the air humming with their hum and the crackling of relays. A young engineer, Lieutenant Arthur Clemens, in charge of the speech recognition system, once fell asleep at the control panel and nearly started a fire. Dr. Weingarten seemed to never sleep. He could be found at 3 a.m. soldering some intricate component, or poring over complex calculations on a whiteboard. After 6 months of titanic reinforcements, the prototype was ready. It was a monstrous structure, occupying an entire room, 40 racks to meters high, weighing over 50 tons and consuming so much power that its connection caused power sags throughout the building. It was nicknamed the Green Monster because of the color of its metal panels. Asterisk, the day of the first test was the moment of truth. A newly intercepted German cipher, a voice message encrypted using the Sachsenhausen system, was placed on the table in front of Weingarten. It was handed to the monster operators. A complex sequence was initiated. The magnetic drums spun, the vacuum tubes flickered, and the needle on the sound head dropped onto one of the noisy records. 10 minutes passed. 20. Weingarten was beginning to lose hope, and suddenly, instead of the hissing white noise, A hoarse but perfectly intelligible voice in German came from the speaker. The redeployment of the 9th Panzer Division to the east is confirmed. Arrival in the Smolensk area is expected by 2 p.m. tomorrow. A deathly silence reigned in the laboratory, broken only by the crackling of the equipment. Then someone let out a strangled breath. Dr. Weingarten slowly removed his glasses and wiped them. He wasn't smiling. He looked at the monster with something akin to fear. They hadn't simply created a machine. They had birthed a new soldier. A soldier who fought with silence and knowledge. The world's first cyberwar had just begun, and they had fired the first, decisive shot. Part 2. Shadows and the third success of the first SIGSALY test was stunning. But real combat use was still a long way off. The green monster was too bulky, too unreliable, and too demanding. It couldn't simply be installed in the Pentagon basement and begin intercepting all broadcasts. A network had to be created. The project received top priority. Bell Labs engineers worked 3 shifts to miniaturize components and improve reliability. Ultimately, the decision was made to deploy not one giant machine, but several dozen SIGSALY terminals, installed in strategic locations around the world: London, Paris, Guam, Cairo. Each terminal was still the size of a small truck and required a separate room with a cooling system. But it was a colossal step forward. A key figure in this network was Captain Jake Malone, a young but precociously gifted linguist and cryptographer. He was transferred from the Enigma unit and appointed head of the Ghost Task Force in London. His job was not only technical, but also interpreting the received data. A machine could decipher a message, but only a human could understand its context and separate the important from the unimportant. The London SIGSALY terminal was housed in the abandoned Down Street tube station, converted into Churchill's top-secret bunker. Deep underground, in a room that had once stored coal reserves, racks of lamps now hummed. The air was thick with the smell of ozone from electrical discharges, and the dust from countless punch cards. The first weeks of operation were like chasing ghosts. SIGSALY produced transcripts, but they were fragmentary, snippets of conversations between Luftwaffe headquarters and an airfield in Normandy, squabbles between Kriegsmarine officers over fuel supplies, reports from the Eastern Front. The information was plentiful, but chaotic. Everything changed one foggy London night. SIGSALY intercepted and, in 18 minutes, decrypted a message that made Malone's blood run cold. It was an order addressed to the commander of the U-30 submarine in the North Atlantic. The message contained the precise coordinates of convoy HX-229, its speed, composition, and even the diversion route, which had been changed just 6 hours earlier. Jake rushed to the phone to contact the Admiralty, but then his gaze fell on the timestamp on the transcript. The message was intercepted and decrypted quickly, but it had been transmitted by German headquarters 12 hours earlier. U-230 had already received the order. The convoy was heading straight into an ambush. There was no way to warn them. Radio silence was the strictest rule for convoys in Wolfpack zones. Jake Malone threw his coffee mug on the floor in rage. They possessed knowledge that could save hundreds of lives, but they were powerless to apply it. It was worse than not knowing at all. It was watching a catastrophe unfold without the ability to shout careful. The next morning, the reports arrived. Convoy HX-229 had been destroyed. The losses were horrific. For the Ghost crew, this was a bitter lesson. Speed of decryption was meaningless without speed of reaction. They began developing new protocols. They created a direct encrypted communications link between Down Street Station and the Naval Command Center and implemented a priority system where messages related to immediate threats were marked as flash and transmitted immediately. Gradually, SIGSALY began to change the course of the war. It didn't prevent every tragedy, but it gave the Allies an incredible advantage: the ability to peer into enemy maps. Thanks to intercepted and quickly decrypted messages, they were able to reroute convoys from wolf packs, adjust bombing strikes on the Krupp factories precisely when workers were changing shifts, which increased casualties, and, most importantly, SIGSALY played a key role in Operation Bodyguard, a deception operation leading up to the Normandy landings. Confident in the reliability of their communications, the Germans continued to use Sachsenhausen to transmit their most sensitive orders. Little did they suspect that their impenetrable fortress of silence turned out to be glass walls, behind which their allies watched their every move. The Ghost had become their nightmare, a shadow in the ether that knew all their secrets. But the greatest threat came not from what SIGSALY heard, but from what it kept silent about. And this fear was about to materialize. Part 3. The Price of the Shadow 1944. The war was slowly but surely drawing to a close. SIGSALY worked like clockwork, its network spreading across the globe. It had become the ears and brains of the Allied command. But in this monotonous, routine work of decrypting thousands of messages lurked the greatest danger: addiction. Success began to breed complacency. Captain Jake Malone, despite all his triumphs, felt a lurking uneasiness. The Germans were meticulous, their messages always meticulous in form and structure. But in recent weeks, he began to notice strange anomalies. Some intercepts, especially from the highest echelons of power, were passing through SIGSALY too. Smoothly, the machine decrypted them faster than usual, almost without noise. At first, he attributed this to improved algorithms, but his linguistic instincts told him something was wrong. The phraseology in these messages was slightly unnatural, as if composed not by a native speaker, but by a highly talented imitator. He shared his suspicions with Weingarten, who by then was overseeing the entire project from Washington. Paranoia. Jake, Weingarten replied over the encrypted line. The machine doesn't make mistakes. Perhaps they've replaced the codebreakers. Or it's just a statistical error. No, sir, Malone insisted. It's like listening to perfectly played music with no soul. I can feel it. They're up to something. They didn't listen. The flow of information was too valuable to be questioned because of the captain's intuition. Meanwhile, in Berlin, a different game was underway. German intelligence, the Abwehr, began to suspect a leak. The losses were too precise. The Allied strikes were landing precisely in vulnerable areas. They couldn't have known about SIGSALY, but they suspected their codes had been compromised. So they decided on a brilliant and risky move: Operation Mirror. Instead of changing the codes, which would have been logical, but would have disrupted their communications, they began broadcasting disinformation. These were specially crafted messages, encrypted by the same Sachsenhausen system, but containing false data. They predicted attacks where none were planned, misplaced divisions, and reported non-existent supply problems. And most importantly, they made this disinformation barely distinguishable from the truth by placing it in the mouths of real generals and admirals, whose voice patterns were well known to SIGSALY. The trap was sprung. The Allied command, blindly trusting the decryptions of the infallible SIGSALY, began acting on the German disinformation. As a result, one of the key offensive operations in Holland failed, hitting fortified areas prepared by the Germans. Losses numbered in the thousands. Air forces bombed empty fields marked in reports as ammunition dumps. The value of SIGSALY collapsed overnight. From a superweapon, it became a source of deadly lies. Panic set in at headquarters. Project Ghost was on the verge of being shut down. Trust was shattered. Jake Malone, who had warned of this, was called into question. Instead of a reprimand, he was given carte blanche to rectify the situation. His team worked in emergency mode. They realized they were facing not a technical problem, but an intellectual challenge. The Germans were playing poker with them, slipping them counterfeit cards. They needed to find a way to distinguish the real thing from the fake, and they found it. They were saved by mathematical linguistics. Malone and his team, mostly philologists and mathematicians, developed a complex algorithm that analyzed not only the content, but also the metadata of a message, the frequency of certain words, syntactic constructions, even the microscopic pauses and intonations characteristic of a particular speaker. SIGSALY was modified. Now it not only decoded a message, but also assigned it a credibility score, a percentage of the probability that it was genuine. It took weeks to train the new system. They ran archives of old, verified intercepts through it to establish a standard, and then new messages. And it worked. The machine began marking messages containing disinformation with red flags. The credibility score for such messages rarely rose above 60%. Genuine orders had a score of 95% or higher. Operation Mirror was exposed. The Allies, now aware of the disinformation channel, were able to turn it to their advantage. They began supplying the Germans with counter-disinformation through the same channel, reinforcing their false beliefs about the Allies' plans. When the war ended, SIGSALY was immediately dismantled. All its components, designs, and documentation were destroyed. Project participants signed decades-long secrecy agreements. Only in the 1970s did the truth about the Ghost begin to emerge, bit by bit. The story of SIGSALY is more than just a technological triumph. It's the story of the birth of a new era, the era of cyber warfare, where battles are fought not with projectiles, but with bits of information. It's the story of the world's first automated hack, which changed the course of the most terrible war in history. But it's also a warning against blind faith in technology, that the most advanced machine is useless without human intuition, doubt, and the ability to see behind the code a living, cunning, and resourceful enemy. They created the ghost to catch shadows, and in the end, they themselves almost became victims of the shadows created by their own creation.